Always unprepared, no expense considered. I am author John A. Douglas. Welcome this evening to this episode of the Author's Outpost, where independent and sometimes even traditionally published authors come to talk about their works and try to find the audience that is looking for their work. And as you can see, no, that is not Gandalf to my side. That is Mr. David V. Stewart, who is joining us this evening. David is a very prolific and well-known self-published author, musician, YouTuber, streamer, and he's someone with a lot of advice about writing for writers and authors of anywhere between the novice and the expert level skills. And David, thank you for joining me this evening.
No problem. Thanks for having me on. Hope you guys are having a good one. Hey, folks.
Before we get started, we're going to go and say hello to the chat real quick. Here before anybody else was, Brian Neymar, friend of the show, said this is going to be good. I hope he's watching. Kiko Man, who is over from the Drink with Crazies channel, who is also the next person. John, don't forget your ears this time. No, I have new earbuds. I had to go out and get some new ones. These are so comfortable. My old ones were dying on his show on Friday, and I couldn't hear anything. I was just standing there like an idiot. Everly Music, good evening. Good to see you. Tom Highland, good to see you as well. Thank you for dropping in. Hail Katie from Periapsis Press. Left Eye Ego says he's just popping in for a quick like and to say, hail, thanks for dropping in. David is streaming over to his channel. Y'all, we are streaming on his channel, on my channel here on YouTube, live on Rumble. If you can go over there and give us a bit of a like and a follow, a comment, anything, help us grow over there. I'm already up to 152 subscribers, which isn't bad for a YouTuber nobody like myself. Andrew Campbell over from Australia is here. Author Michael F. Kane, thank you for being here. Timo Berman, good to see you, sir. Yes, Brian Neymar is here and watching, as is Kyle Potter. Good to see you. Good to thank you, everyone. We're going to roll real quick to see how the David, this is a bit of a tradition on my channel. I'm going to roll to see how the live stream goes. No fudging the dice at my table. That's a nat 1. That is a first for the show. But I tell you what, if you got some dice, you can roll with advantage on your end.
Oh, they're around here. I got a bunch. My kids all play with them because I don't really do like RPGs or anything anymore. The closest thing is probably Hero Quest with my son, but I don't really do tabletop stuff because I just don't have the time or space.
I hear you.
So the dice are mostly like kids' toys, or like my son will make up a game with dice. Like, if you roll this, then you die. And it's like, you died. Oh, great.
I'm the same way. My youngest son wants to play Dungeons and Dragons. Please excuse that white noise. My wife is printing out recipes sometimes when I'm streaming. And he'll say, play Dungeons and Dragons. And it's roll dice, and whatever he decides to say happens. But that's all well and good.
I mean, to be honest, that's kind of like the modern D&D approach. Is like it's just a loose framework for pretend play, which is why kids like the idea. It's like, oh yeah, I'll roll the dice and that'll see if I kill the orc, and that'll be cool. And if I don't kill the orc, maybe I'll get 20 other tries to kill the orc.
Right.
So,
there was one recent Wizards of the Coast release. I can't remember which module they released it in, where it's had basically, this is how you can play the game without using the dice. I'm thinking, so just a round robin story, basically.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to happens. But at that point, you might as well just be writing a collaborative story with folks.
Yeah, we call that playing a game. Yeah, we call that LARP, right? Like live action role play. It's like, yeah, that's, or the murder mystery stuff that people would do. It's like, you're having a murder mystery tonight. We're all in the Victorian period. I'm like, that's fun. It's not, that's not what D&D is or was to me.
Right.
So, but it's okay. That's what people like, I guess. And that's fine for kids. I find games like Hero Quest tend to be really good for younger players because it's a more limited rule set that's a little bit easier to navigate. You don't have to keep track of a billion skills. You just sort of gain things as you play. So when you first start playing, it's like rules light. And by the time you get to the end playing, it's like rules medium, maybe. And since it's tactical, you're moving around a board. It's a lot easier for kids to have fun with the spatial arrangement of something like Hero Quest versus Dungeons and Dragons.
I think for a lot of kids, especially, part of the appeal of that is when you have the physical tabletop, the minis, and the stuff that I got some around here myself. They're all over the floor. I learned from Professor Dungeon Master on YouTube how to make my own tiles and stuff like that. These are my fancy ones. They have little magnets on the side so they don't fall apart, and they can flip over to become like a wood board. And I've got like columns and boulders, doors, things like that, and they love pulling these things out and playing with them. It really is a lot of fun. But there a lot of people come up against the way the game is being presented and run in modern times, and it doesn't really mesh well, especially with the way it was played back in the old days, back when the OGs like Arch Snow were playing it. And I noticed, and it's hard for me to kind of reconcile that a little bit because I'm a little bit of a late bloomer. I didn't start actually playing until 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
When I realized the only way that I would ever end up playing, because I couldn't find anyone to play around here with, was I was going to have to be the DM for my kid. And so that sent me down a really fun, creative road. And it's more of a family thing these days. Hero Quest, though, I remember that, and I never got the chance to play it.
Yeah, Hero Quest is basically a dungeon crawler. So if you've played, I'm trying to think of like a more, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons can be a dungeon crawler depending on which edition you're using and where your emphasis is. But really, it's a big board, and you can arrange it a couple different ways. There's like it is a PvE game. That is, you're not playing against other people like a lot of board games. But you have different classes. Like you could be the barbarian, or you could be the dwarf. There's a class that's just autofocus is tripping out here. Class is just dwarf, right? So you go and you roll through those, and you go through, explore the dungeon, and try to get loot. That's like, that's the game. So it works. It works for that.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of loot, I made a little bit like little loot tokens for my own game for my kids. They love these things. If you got kids, they love trying to go over these because they see the nice little shiny stuff on the board. That's their first thought. Oh, I have to go for that. And then you start getting to play with teenagers, and then every session ends in arson. It's not even funny how often arson pops up, not only as just a vehicle for success, but how often it actually succeeds.
Yeah.
But D&D aside, David, I usually start especially with authors, where we all start when it comes to our journey in writing. Where did you start wanting to write, and what kind of led you along the path to end up in self-publishing?
So it's a lot. I mean, it's a long story. Like I wrote my first book in the early 2000s, really. And of course, like first time you do something, you suck at it. So
yeah,
that book exists as I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry,
Perfectly.
my mixer just showed me like not having any input on my microphone. So I was just like, okay, I want to make sure. So yeah, that book is in like fragments as a memory of the first time I ever tried to do something. I got distracted by this whole having a career in music thing, and I taught at the university level and stuff for a number of years. Went to Vegas for a while. I was a performer there, and I decided the music business pretty much sucks. So I was like, what's my next business going to be? What am I going to get into? And so I decided I was going to transition into writing. My brother-in-law, who was my roommate at the time, not yet my brother-in-law, we wrote some scripts. He knew a producer in Hollywood by the name of Paul Allen. And we got those kind of, we worked with him for a while, and that relationship kind of fell apart because I was relying on my writing partner for it, and he wasn't really interested in pursuing that career. And so I was writing books at the time too. And I wrote this, this was not the second book I'd written another book that was really long. And then I kind of put that one to the side, took the lessons that I'd figured out, and I wrote Muramasa Blood Drinker, the samurai story that kind of popped into my head while I was, I guess, a substitute teacher one day when I was living in LA. And I figured out after writing that book that no one was going to publish it. It's a genre that, as far as mainstream publishing goes, doesn't exist. Not only does it not exist, but especially by the mid 2000s, I was the wrong skin color to publish anything that was about a culture that wasn't. Well, I was the wrong skin color to publish anything. I could probably end the statement there. But certainly to like write samurai fiction, it's like, you're writing about Japanese culture. It's like, yeah, so there's all kinds of Japanese stuff about European knights. Who cares about that? Like, no one cares. Like, the people who actually read it don't care. No Japanese person that's read my book has ever cared that I'm not Japanese. They just care that the story's good. So I didn't want this book to just die, right? So, after doing the dumb little, I don't know what to call it, like querying agents hop, trying to find, begging someone to take 15% of your money so that a publisher will print your book. I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to publish it myself. And I did. And I learned a lot from that process and had a lot of fun with it.
Oh, and so I'm learning a lot of it right now. Still waiting on my cover to come in too. So, yeah. But, and now this was about what? About 2014, 2015, about the time that Amazon's self-publishing apparatus started to pop up?
Oh, it was big by that time. So I think Muramasa came out in 2016 is when I finally published it. I wrote it in like 2014 is when I wrote it. So there was a 2-year delay between when I wrote it and when I published it, simply because I didn't know anything about publishing books, right? I had never done that. And everything I knew about how to get a book published was from the early 2000s when I was a university student. And so that's what I did, right? And then I figured out, oh, yeah, you can. By that point, Amazon had really already ascended, and it was like the dominant thing. Indie publishing had completely eclipsed traditional publishing by the mid-2000s. So as far as getting in on the ground floor, I was not in on the ground floor anywhere close to it. I was getting in at the peak. Now, there's been a lot more books published since then, but as far as the peak of when people were really heavily publishing books and finding success, like 2016 to 2020, probably 2018 was probably the peak of what was going on there. So I got in really not at a great time, but maybe at a better time than if you're starting in 2023, simply because there's more uncertainty now. There was like an established way to do things in 2016. Which I can go over, except to note that the established way to do things doesn't really work anymore. So anyone that's thinking
strategy.
Yeah. So the strategy was, in short, you publish a book, you advertise, you dump a bunch of money into advertising and sell copies, which will rank the book up. And once the book is ranked so high in the categories that the book belongs in, then you can stop advertising and Amazon will sell your book for you. And so what I mean by that is that, like, they'll just show your book to people searching for relevant keywords and stuff like that your book is related to. The problem with that now is that, first of all the categories are borked. So you get all kinds of books that don't belong. And which means if you're in like a niche category, it used to be like you'd find a niche category and you'd write a book in it and you'd advertise, you'd pump it up, get some reviews, and then Amazon would sell the book for you and you just like have passive income from that. That don't work anymore. If you write a little niche genre, someone looks for that niche genre and they won't see any books they want to read. They're going to see 20 books that are ranked higher in semi-related or completely unrelated genres. Like try looking up superhero fiction or something like that. You're going to find a bunch of comic books, which people are not looking for when they're looking for superhero novels. And you're going to find like just a bunch of other unrelated crap. And then you might find, down the list, you might find Brandon Sanderson's superhero novel and then a bunch of unrelated stuff. And then everything else is ads. So the way that you have to sell a book now is like, you can't ever take the gas off the advertising if you want to be selling. That gas, you have to have your pedal to the metal. You got to be throwing money into advertising all the time or no one will ever see your book. It'll be so buried in the search results and the bad categorization You won't see it. In fact, on Amazon, the ads are a more accurate representation of what people want than the actual search results. And you could try this with products. You could try this with books. It just takes a little bit of looking around. The sponsored ads are more targeted towards what you're looking for because they're using hundreds of keywords sometimes. They're highly focusing on what you're typing in, and they're spending a lot of money to show it to you, knowing that it's the product that you're going to buy based on those keywords. It's really focused. So the advertising is actually more accurate now than the search results are going to be, and the ranking is going to be by a lot, which is weird, but that's how it is. So if you're not going to be dropping a bunch of money into advertising, it's really hard to get Amazon to automatically sell your book, to get that like viral selling. It just doesn't happen on Amazon anymore. It's too hard to massage the system without a lot of capital to go into it. So Amazon is what I call, and I'll write an article about this probably next week. It's what I call a win more strategy. So a win more strategy means you're already really popular. You already have a big audience. You already have a lot of money in the bank. Then you can advertise. You can get a lot of reviews with your audience that is already established, and you can make a lot of money on Amazon. The problem is, what do you do if it's your first book, your second book, your third book? What if it's like your first little series of books? How do you do that? Well, it's really hard. It's really hard. You have to look off the site just to get enough reviews to get people to even click on something on Amazon. Will require a lot of effort and maybe even money. I know people that pay for reviews. This is another dirty secret. People pay for reviews. They pay for Chinese click farmers to download their book on Kindle Unlimited and click through it. They basically just have a bunch of KU accounts that click through the book to rank it up. So you're basically paying for advertising, but you're not, it won't say sponsored. It'll just be ranked number one because you pay Chinese farmers to click through the book. There's all kinds of little scams that people do. And it's like a whole nother job. And it's a whole nother job that I personally don't want to do. So I've been looking off of Amazon to like boost my Amazon ranking for years now, because I don't want to spend like what I think Brian said it in chat was spend $5,000 per month in ads to get $2,000 in royalties and make it up in volume. That's how it is. That's what
before you continue real quick, I've got to stop you and I've got to address I got a super chat for the first time, $100 from Kikomon. Show you Kikomon. Congrats on monetization. I have just been monetized not that long ago. Make sure to keep up the daily soy sauce intakes. Goat for Royce. David, that is all a bunch of in jokes with a drink with Royce from A Drink with Crazy, as he's being badgered by women to buy his wife a goat. And Kikomon is a very appreciative and aggressively supportive member of Royce's community, and now mine. Thank you, Kikomon, awesome. Especially now because even though I've gotten $5-10 super chats here and there over the last, I haven't actually crossed the threshold to get a payout from YouTube yet. This will put me over the threshold. I can actually get money now, and of course put it right back into investing in the book and future books. R.H. Snow is here. Thank you for being here. Ben Dowdy. Drake Tungsten is also here. Beard of Darkness Book Reviews has decided to jump in. Thank you guys for being here. So sorry to interrupt you, David. I did have to address that super chat. But, that was actually a big one. My wife will be thrilled.
It's awesome. So anyway, yeah, like that business, that was how it was. And, I invested a lot of time in learning that. And, my brother-in-law did courses on this kind of stuff. And what you kind of figured out is like, the proof in the pudding's in the eating, and it don't taste good, right? It's a job that's not very fun to me. I know some people, it's like right up their alley, which is like massaging keywords and doing advertising all day to sell maybe a book that they don't, it's about selling the book, not about writing the book. And I care about writing the book more than selling it, I guess. I want to make something that's cool, not just sell something and say I was a best-selling author. You'll find all kinds of YouTube videos. People like, here, I made a best-selling book that's blank.
Yeah, Yeah, that
You can do it.
that
It's not hard.
New York Times bestseller tags, it doesn't have quite the prestige that it used to, and the only authors that really seem to care about it are the ones that care about the prestige of having it. But
I think
you
it's
find a lot of readers don't really put much credence in it these days.
yeah, I think it's a good um I think it's a good way to sell. So let's talk about marketing a little bit because everyone should know about it. How you sell your book hasn't changed that much, other than like there's no everyone's trying to game the system. They're like, how do I tickle the robot, and how do I offer the robot the correct offerings for it to give me success and money? I want cargo, right? We approach the algorithm like a cargo cult. Um, but the way that you market stuff hasn't really changed. It's the same way that you did it on a bookshelf, but we're just kind of doing it more virtually and kind of adding things to it. What we're doing now is the equivalent of like an author book signing in a way, right? So a social interaction with the author that attracts readers and maybe persuades them to look at the books, like a book signing. A book signing is kind of a win more strategy too, but really it's a sales strategy. So someone sees a book cover they like, they pick up in a physical store, they pick up the book, they look at the back of it, the blurb, get a little description, and then they maybe read the first page. They look at some things that are on the cover, like who has a pull quote about it. The best book I've read in years. The new hit sci-fi, whatever. Best New York Times bestseller on somewhere on the cover. That's another proof. So getting a best-selling book matters because that is a social proof. So social proof, yeah. So you have the image, the description, then you have social proof. So on Amazon, someone will see an image, click on it, read the blurb, check the reviews, and see what other human beings think. If there's no reviews, they may stop their buying process right there and really think about it. Now, this book just came out. It's from an unknown author. It might suck. I better look closely at the first couple pages to make sure it doesn't suck. And if your first couple pages are dynamite, that person's going to buy the book without the social proof if you sold them enough on the cover and the description. So if your cover and your blurb are good enough, you can get someone to kind of skip over that social proof. But if the social proof is there, then people will buy it just on that. So bestsellers that other people liked the thing, that means I'll probably like the thing too. It makes a lot of sense, and it's part of how you sell it. Same thing with awards, right? Like privately, I can kind of crap on awards and be like, the awards are dumb and blah, blah, blah. But would I be really happy if I won a Nebula award? Or I can't actually, the Nebulas is the SFWA. I don't think I would ever join them, even though I qualify. Because I just, certain clubs, I don't want the, what's the opposite of prestige? I don't want the spiritual guilt of association.
I get what you're saying. I don't think of the.
If it was like a Worldcon or Dragon Award, absolutely, that's great. You can build a career on a Worldcon or Dragon Award because that's a social proof. Not only did other people like it, important people liked it. Those important people who give awards. Never mind that Worldcon is like, people who know about the awards know that
John Delarose
doesn't really work that way, right? But it works for sales, and that's important. So if you can get one for sales, then go for it. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's the psychological aspect of it. People see the blank award winner and like, oh, I don't know what the Dragon Award is, but obviously they won one. Brian Neymar is saying ignominy.
That's it.
That's broke out the thesaurus for that one.
Yeah,
I've got a big
like sometimes it's like, what's the opposite? What's the opposite of?
I've got a touch of the tism, so a lot of times I'll sit there and I'll know something, or I'll know how to do it, or know what I'm talking about. But when it comes to explaining to someone else, I'm just sitting here thinking, you know what? It's not worth it to try and explain.
Yeah,
I know when I got into when I started looking into the switching from wanting to be traditional published, which was as daunting today a prospect as it was when I first made the decision back in the mid 2000s of wanting to, pursue the, the career of being an author. But now it's even more so. You're against the 8 ball. I shared a tweet not that long ago about a literary young adult agent who is like, this is everything that I'm looking for and everything I'm not looking for. And basically, everything she was looking for was give me a same-sex romantic version of my favorite animes, is what it read like.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I'm out because that's not what I write. And that excludes a lot of really good authors.
So agents will sell you on their agent fees based on them doing a service for you. What service are they doing for you? Let's sit and think about it. Well, it's kind of like the guy from Office Space. Engineers are not good at talking to people. It's like you can't just directly talk to the publisher. It's like, why not? It's like they're basically in a secondhand way hiring the agent, who also often lives at like poverty level, doing this job to read books and filter them for the publisher. Well, how did someone be an agent? Well, you just say you're an agent, and you have to know some people that work at the publisher. Yeah. So you're paying somebody to talk to their friend from graduate school about the book that you wrote and why they should publish it. That's running an agent. And over the years, like the things that agents have put out what they want, it used to be they never said this. What you would do is, like, let's say you wrote a book that was like a Harry Dresden book. So right. You'd go look up whoever his agent was. And then you'd go send a query letter to him because your book was similar, and therefore he would know whether it sucked or, who to hire to edit it. If you needed to hire an editor, or like who to talk to, he would know what to do with it. Right. Or tell you, you need to write another book. This one is not going to be it. Right. Agents will do that. At least they used to. So that's used to be how you do it. And then you go query them, and then you hear back. This was one of the things I ran into with samurai fiction. Oh, this book is so original. There's literally no one out there who's ever repped a book like this. Ever. Right. So who do you talk to? It's like I was talking to fantasy agents and science fiction agents, historical fiction guys, and they're like, there's no market for this. No one ever. It's like the closest book to this is Shogun, and that was published 50 years ago.
And they never get the idea
no one's
that,
gonna publish it.
Okay, there's no trend to attach this to. They never think to themselves, gee, this could start a trend. This could be a trend setter that others could follow. That's something that I've always believed in. Like when I write my books, I say it's comparable in tone to something like, say, Dragonlance. But I've never really tried to latch it on and say, this is Dragonlance meets blank. Because
to me, the elevator pitch.
Right, the elevator pitch. And I get the elevator pitch has its place, but personally for me, it always feels like I'm simply attaching what I've written to essentially the coattails of better authors. And to me, that brings in a bit of an unfair comparison to what you're doing. Because if you're saying this is Harry Potter meets the Dresden Files, what they're going to think when they're reading it is, okay, but this is definitely not as good as Harry Potter and the Dresden Files, even if it's good on its own. I would rather have somebody compare their work to mine.
Yeah,
right?
And Harry Potter was published in the 90s when you didn't query with these log lines and stuff. You didn't have to do that. And probably Harry Potter was originally published because of its similarity to other kinds of fiction for kids, specifically stuff like Roald Dahl. It like lots of school stuff, but fantasy. So it's like Roald Dahl, but wizards, right? And so that's how maybe you sold it. Now it's really nothing like that, but it gets you an idea of like where to put the book and who the target audience is going to be. And then it sets a new trend by being a little bit outside of those things. The best stuff is always outside. And the tough thing is that it's hard to, especially now, I feel like there's a lot less risk taking in traditional publishing because it's been so hard put upon over the last 10 or 15 years that a lot of them won't take chances. And then when they do, it's only on things that is like a political pet project. Oh, this is by a Pox.
Yeah.
It's really funny to call them Pox. We want more books by Pox, and we want more books by various minorities or whatever. And it's like, that's your measuring stick for whether you're going to publish an outside book. Otherwise you have to be, it's only win more, right? Like Jim Butcher will have no problem publishing any book he wants to publish. He's not going to get ousted because he's the wrong member of a group. The problem is the person at ground zero, the person who's at the ground floor. They can't get in. There's no rung for them, and you're only putting the rungs down for people who've been historically discriminated against. That's just how it is right now. I don't know.
To me, it's a layer. It's another layer between you and your reader, and that is one of the things that I have come to like the most about self-publishing is when I started looking into making the transition to like, well, okay, there's no path for me in traditional publishing. I'm a straight white guy. Obviously, that's not what they're looking for anymore. But self-publishing. I was looking at guys like probably the best example, just John Delarose and Eric July and Ethan Van Sciver, and they are sitting there doing what I'm doing. They got the YouTube channel and they're talking directly to their audience and they're talking to other creators with a like-minded audience. And there's no barrier between them and their audience and their potential readers. And there's no strategy that you can't try in this matrix to try and make it work. I've been over the past week dropping lore videos for my upcoming book release at the end of this month to try and get people, a little interested, a little bits of, tidbits of information. And, other people aren't doing it, but by God, I'm going to try it. And those layers between you and your audience are trying to filter out what is genuinely making what you're writing less unique and filter it down, because you can over edit something. You can edit it so much that it just reads very bland, borderline like a Wikipedia article at times.
Yeah.
The example that I pulled off the shelf was a friend of the show, Christopher Brenning. This is also the artist who is doing my cover. That Hellborn King. This is a grimdark novel, but it was a fantastic book. It was one of the best books that I've ever read. And I keep finding this in indie publishing, books that are on par, if not better than what we're getting from TradPub these days. And he was told by agents that this is a fantastic story, but we can't sell it. So he took the self-publishing route, and now he's a year after the release. And so it's really starting to pick up steam and build more of a momentum as an author. And he's gaining a reputation. And you don't need the big publishing houses for that, because they're still asking authors, smaller authors in-house, to increase their social media presence. I did a video on this last year, or the year before. E.K. Johnston is a Star Wars author, and she bristled at the notion that Penguin House was asking her to increase her social media presence, do more stuff online. She felt it wasn't her place as an author to go out and do the marketing for these big houses. But the game's changed, and us authors who are able to go out there and market ourselves, market our own books, we've got a leg up on them as the competition.
Yeah, the business used to be about a physical presence in a store. Like, that's what really mattered. People will buy things that were on the shelf. So
that's how I bought them.
Yeah, if you had control of the shelf, then you could guarantee that at least a couple of the books would sell. Turns out that that's not really the case. Now, I want to address a comment that R.H. Snow made, because this is really important to understand a little bit about how this industry works, at least the traditional published industry.
This one?
About ESG pumping money to the CEO to crank out that favored content. This has actually been going on long before there was any kind of ESG trickery. The truth is that, the publishing houses are run by people. They have their favorite people and their friends that they can publish, and they run a money game so that their losses are less than what they ought to be, because they can take somebody and publish a book, print off 3,000 copies, ship them off to all the stores, and then they could sell 10 or 12 copies, and they just destroy the rest of them and write it off as a loss. So every dollar they spend making a book, they can write it off on their taxes as a loss to offset any kind of money that they've spent. Well, how do they, you have to make some money. Well, they're kept afloat by the back catalog of all of these older authors. So Robert Jordan and Jim Butcher kind of keep the fantasy, and Brandon Sanderson kind of keep the fantasy boat afloat at a lot of these publishing houses like Tor. And then they can give out little advances. $1,500 advance is only a small portion of the money that they would make off a Robert Jordan book in a given year. So they give that to their friend. Yeah, it doesn't recoup. The person drops off the map. The books are destroyed. You write it off as a loss. And you get the paper at a discount too. So even the cost of printing is subsidized in different weird ways. It's a weird money game where most of the books aren't read and end up being burned or thrown away. That's why when you get a book and it says, if you got this book without a cover, it may have been reported damaged or, destroyed. What does that mean? Well, they intentionally throw the books away that they don't sell, right? Because it's cheaper than shipping them back. Hey, publisher, we're not selling any copies of this lesbian romance. Okay, destroy them and we'll write them off. And then what they used to do is take the dust jacket off the hardback and mail that back because you can mail it back for a couple cents, and then just throw the rest of the book away or put it in shredder, burn it for firewood, whatever you want to do with it.
And that's a real shame because, there are some genuinely decent authors who are kind of lost up in that mix. But like, if you're not the Kings or the Sandersons of the world, the publishers aren't going to be marketing you like that. You're not going to be getting that exposure. And I don't know, David, how long you think this shell game can kind of keep going on before, these publishers really start to either scale down significantly or.
So I think there's always like an eventual point where even the biggest company can't make the money. But we've seen the number of publishers shrink. So it used to be the big six. And before it was the big six, it was just lots of publishers. Went to the big six through conglomeration in the 90s. And I wrote a little bit about this on my Substack. And I don't remember all the details. That's why I wrote them down. I wrote it so I wouldn't have to remember it. Within a couple of years in 1997, we went from like 20 major publishers to 6 within like 18 months. They all bought each other and condensed. Why were they doing that? Well, because the industry was shrinking. So conglomerations tend to happen when it's difficult to stay afloat on your own. That's why you look to sell out and you look to buy, because that person you're buying has a bunch of assets, which you can cut some of their assets out, sell them, and mix them with yours, have more intellectual properties with less personnel. It becomes more efficient. Now we're at big 5, possibly big 4 by the time we're done, of English language publishers. They're all owned, if you look deep enough, they're all owned by large multinational conglomerates that own media companies and land and everything you could imagine. So at a certain point, the company that owns them may make a decision that like it's not working and there has to be a major restructuring of that element, or they can float them basically forever using some of the tax schemes we talked about. If they're having a loss, then you can write that off on your taxes. Like Marvel and DC don't really make money. They're owned by bigger companies who kind of keep them around as story farms. And then, if they lose money, just lowers our tax burden by that much, right? It's just like we didn't make that much taxes. It all kind of works out at the end. It's not a major cost for them. So because they're floated by these bigger companies, I don't know. It can go on for a long time. And people ask, like, how long can Clown World go on at Disney? I mean, it could go on for decades because of the amount of property they own. As long as they can keep leveraging debt against things that they own and are valued as part of the company, then they can continue spending their money however they want. It's just at a certain point, there might be a leadership who wants the company to make money. There might be stockholders that eventually vote in different leadership to make money. That thing is possible. There's this idea that, stockholders can prosecute someone for fiduciary irresponsibility, intentionally losing money. And that's really rare. Like technically, yes, but good luck trying to look up a case where someone has successfully prosecuted a CEO for intentionally losing money and not executing their fiduciary responsibility to their company. It's really, really rare. Anyway,
right, because if you do it to one, then you've got the scarlet letter, and who's going to work with you again, and get a bit of a brand. It's the cycle of nobody wanting to really take the shot because it would end up being a circular firing squad, and it's a bit of a big mess, and that's why I like self-publishing so much. Yes, it's a lot of hard work, but I mean, from my perspective, hard work's the only thing I've ever been good at. So it just feels natural to me to, just come in and go balls to the wall and do everything I can to try and make it successful. And I found this out when I was younger, and I used to go on vacations that were planned by other people that always ended up going sideways in certain ways that, frankly, I'd rather be the one in charge of steering the boat than riding somebody else's boat that obviously doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah, so the hard work, like this used to be, I don't know, what attracts me to traditional publishing is that it would be less work for me. That's that's the main attraction. Probably won't make more money, but it's less work. Like I won't have to worry about designing covers, and I won't have to worry about market. Well, I still have to market, right? So the old idea that like it would be less work for me is like, is it really? Like they want people to get out and sell the books for them. I make less royalties on the back end. It's like, it's not really a big winning proposition in 2023 to be traditionally published, unless you're in one of those win more categories, like you're Jim Butcher or something, in which case, yeah, you're going to make a ton of money having your book in the airport or at Costco, right? For everybody else, it's not, you're still doing the same amount of work. You're not designing the cover, but that could be bad because there's nothing to say that the traditional publisher is going to pick out a good cover for you. They could pick out a really bad one.
Right. Do you remember that kerfluffle that happened on social media years ago with Terry Goodkind when he called out?
Yeah. So his cover was actually really good. I made a whole video on this. I'm like, this is an awesome cover. However, Terry's lucky that he has publishers who will have good covers because his choice in covers are bloody awful. Like but he had this idea that like he wasn't writing fantasy, he was
a little pretentious.
Books. He was kind of pretentious about it. And actually I really like Terry Goodkind, and I think he's as a grumpy old man, I like him. Me talking smack on Terry is not really me hating him. It's mostly like just I'm concerned about marketing. And sorry, they picked a really good cover to sell your book to the readers of fantasy who are your main audience.
Yeah.
I know that you kind of see yourself as the fantasy Ayn Rand, but
he always resented that he was grouped in with a genre. But dude, you are writing fantasy. Why?
It's fine.
He felt his themes were more important than the genre that he was writing. And I think he thought of it as kind of a denigrated genre of sorts, something more childish, and his ideas were above that. But
based on when did Wizard's first rule come out? Does anybody know that? I want to say it was like
early 90s, I think. That was early 90s.
Okay, I'm going to Google it real quick because I think you're onto something. Because
I have always seen his books as a combination of old school epic fantasy combined with that. Yeah, combined with that. Remember when the 90s hit and everything got emo and gritty and, more grim dark a little bit. And he really married that kind of grim dark that 90s edge into the genre. Yeah, he's a bit of a mixed bag because, I mean, like that first book, if you can get past that first book, because that was a bit of a shock to people who are used to going from Tolkien to Dragonlance to Goodkind. Holy cow. That extended torture sequence, especially. I get what he was going with that, but that's not usually what folks went into epic fantasy for. Yeah. So,
so I'm gonna give a slightly different perspective. One of the reasons that I think he felt that way, and I understand it, is because coming out of the 1980s, the way the genre was in the 1980s to the 1990s was much more. It was a much more young, not as dark genre compared to the 70s and 60s. So if you were to put Terry Goodkind's book up against Michael Moorcock or Glenn Cook, this is very dark fantasy, right? Yeah. This stuff is way darker than most fantasy of the 1980s. And it's not that if you like Dragonlance, that's great. But Dragonlance kind of became the standard. And what was the other one? Oh, in 1980.
Jordan?
Brian will remember it. It's like ground zero for the 1980s like fantasy. So looking at the kind of cheese of the 80s
Yeah.
You know, I don't hate any stuff from the 80s, but like David Eddings, those kind of books. I understand Terry's like, I'm not part of that. I'm like doing something bigger. And it's like, yeah, I totally get that. But bro, you're still writing fantasy. Lord of the Rings has amazing themes.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
fantasy.
and he took chances with his books that a lot of authors wouldn't have had the leeway. Because in the late 90s was when I started getting into fantasy. And whenever I go to the bookshelf and the Walden books, that's where I bought all my fantasy. You know, his series always had its own shelf by itself. And so presented as it was, I assumed that, you know, there was a reason it was, you know, so prominently displayed, and started getting into that. And his books could be a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, there was one Phantom, not Phantom, was it Phantom or Chainfire? I think it was Phantom. That one I got so sick of, I actually was reading it at work on my lunch break, and I closed it and I threw it across the room into a trash can. And then I later went and fished it out because I can't stand not knowing how a story ends. And, you know, there was that one book he had where it was presented from a bunch of side characters, and Richard was very tertiarily involved. But then there were some that were just absolute bangers. Like my favorite Terry Goodkind book was Faith of the Fallen. You know, you taking him out of his element, putting him into this authoritarian socialistic society. And what does Richard do? He overthrows their society by making a capitalist underground and then inspiring people through the power of art. Yes, more of that, please. And
it's like the fountainhead of fantasy.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what he wanted to do. I think he's very influenced by Ayn Rand. There's nothing wrong with that. Ayn Rand wrote science fiction. This is another thing too, right? So when I'm like, oh, Ayn Rand wrote science fiction, they're like, what? It's like, yeah, she wrote like high concept science fiction. What's so weird about that? Well, I'm used to science fiction being this idea of spaceships. And, you know, you have people get this idea of what science fiction is supposed to be based on kind of current year ideas of the last maybe 20 years of genre development, not really what the kind of broad thoughts about what science fiction was maybe 40, 50 years ago, or even longer. You know, science fiction 100 years ago was Edgar Rice Burroughs. It was like Princess of Mars, and Tarzan was considered science fiction. Yeah. Whereas that seems now. But, you know, it's kind of like heavy metal, right? Like, when does heavy metal start? It's like, if you listen to Judas Priest, it sounds nothing like Cannibal Corpse, but they only, you know, they're less than 20 years apart. It's like things can change quick.
Yeah, we're starting to get fiction that is inspired by people who are writing derivatives of things that inspired the people who inspired them. You know, it's almost like a copy of a copy of a copy. Like Christopher Brenning's book, the Hellborn King. I asked him on his interview, what inspired you? I said, what fantasy books did you read? He says, well, I'm not really much of a reader, he said. He didn't even read fantasy. He was inspired by Game of Thrones, the TV show. And he went into that. And to his credit, he wrote a fantastic book. Didn't even use an editor either. And I couldn't believe the hell out of that. But, you know, that's where a lot of the genre is these days. You know, the things that were big in the last 10 to 15 years are what's inspiring a lot of people now. It's like one reason Grimdark's so big, and then some people are tired of it. Then you have people trying to want to, you know, bring it back to its more heroic roots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was a problem I ran into. Hold on, I'm going to get a couple of my books real quick.
All right, I'm going to go to the chat. Heavily Music. I love how many metal fans are in these circles. Right? It's always it's such a very bombastic and good metal. I don't listen to too much. All right, Snow says the influence of Doom in video games cannot be understated, and that is true. I myself was inspired by a lot of video games. I don't know if you can hear me, David. You can't hear me. Talk. Y'all say funny things. Call David names while he's got his back turned. All right, Nico, thank you for dropping in. Brian McCoppin, I did not say hello to you earlier because I don't have Brian for too long. I'm sorry, Brian. I don't have David for too long tonight, so I didn't want to interrupt him too much. But Star-Studded Chat, everybody is here. Yes, I got it. And Kikoman, thank you again for the $100 super chat. I appreciate it. very much. T. Alex Ratcliffe, I love being able to write my books off on taxes. Take that, IRS. Thank you for jumping in, man. I appreciate it. Beard of Darkness came back.
All right.
And he's going to be doing his thing.
Grab my
R.H. Snow mentioned something earlier while your back was turned.
Here.
We were.
There we go. Have to use earbuds.
Okay.
If I'm wearing the
okay,
hat.
he's back. Stop making fun of him. Okay. We're calling you names while you were gone. RH Snow said something interesting, and I want to mention that. And we've reached the spousal interference portion of the lifestyle.
Man, we live in a great time where you can get like really high quality in-ear monitors and headphones for like nothing. It's wow. It's crazy. These would have cost like $200 like 20 years ago.
Wow. Yikes. Yeah, I resisted having earbuds for a long time, and then I got them. I'm like, wow, these are actually really great. I thought they looked stupid, but I like using them, and I don't have to blast my phone when I'm listening to stuff while working. RH Snow said the influence of Doom in video games cannot be understated. I kind of agree because I've noticed when you stream games, you're streaming usually JRPGs, which is my favorite game genre and has been for a long time. I discovered it almost at the exact same time that I discovered getting into fantasy books. And I've kind of looked at JRPGs as the epic fantasy novels of the video game world.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Do you have a favorite one?
Favorite JRPG? I mean, I would probably say it depends how you define JRPG, but like, I'll give you like a couple of my favorites. Final Fantasy IV. I played that game. I've played it now a bunch of times, and each time I go back and play it, I'm like, will this hold up? And it's like, it really does hold up. It's got a great story, good gameplay, awesome aesthetics. It's just a really great game. Golden Sun, the first two Golden Sun games for the Game Boy Advance, way better than any kind of little handheld game should have been for the early 2000s. But they're amazing stories, amazing worlds, great characters. Everything about them is just top notch. Like it's like if you put them together as one game, because it made such a big game, they had to split it onto two carts. But if you look at them as one game, it's like a 10 out of 10 game. It's great.
I'm due for a replay of those, but time.
Final Fantasy Tactics. Raul Nyanzi says Fire Emblem. My favorite Fire Emblem game is Fire Emblem Awakening. We're kind of in the tactical genre, right? And I love tactics games as well. So if you're including that, then Final Fantasy Tactics. Of Fire Emblem games, I like Fire Emblem Awakening. That might be a little too new for people, but man, they really like nailed the story and the gameplay is excellent. And I'm a big fan actually of Final Fantasy 12. Now, every Final Fantasy game is going to have some controversy over like whether it's good or not, with few exceptions. Somebody's going to think Final Fantasy 4 sucks, as classic as that one is. I hate it because I didn't get to pick what my classes were. It's like, okay, complaint noted, right? It's a great game. So, everyone's going to have debates over that, but Final Fantasy 12 just had such a great world and such an interesting and deep lore to it and such a good battle system. It's a game that I feel like every time I think the last time I played it, I got through it and I was like, I feel like that I only did like half the game. There's like another half of the game that I could have just optionally explored and never really did.
Yeah.
So those are probably my favorites.
I've got a shorthand of 5. Sometimes it fluctuates a little.
I like Final Fantasy V a lot. It has one of my favorite class systems.
This is not really in any specific order, but these are the ones that I always go back to the most. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is a special place in my heart. Lost Odyssey for the Xbox 360.
Oh, that was
that was the real
Sakaguchi
Final Fantasy
did that
13
game, right? That was the Sakaguchi game, wasn't it?
Yes.
After he left Square, yes.
He basically went out of Square and basically made another Final Fantasy game. After playing Final Fantasy 13, that POS. Yes, Suikoden 2, which I have not finished yet, so I can't throw it on the list. Dragon Quest 8 for the PS2 was also an exceptionally good one, and what a great iconic soundtrack to that. The first and favorite Final Fantasy that I played was 9, and I love the lighthearted theme to it. It's been my until it gets a little darker later in the game. And one that's not always going to be on a lot of people's lists, but it holds a special place in my heart. I spent 2 weeks when I was off of school tech school in '99 playing this game to completion. It's called Thousand Arms for the PS1. And that one was interesting because that one was a weird little dating sim built into the game that tied into it. It had the tone of a lighthearted anime. It's a lot of fun. And unfortunately, it's never been ported to anything else. Crusader Saracen for a 2 says, as Wizard levels up, his hat grows longer. That is correct, and that is now canon. JD Cohen is correct, though. Suikoden 1 and 2 are amazing. I played 1 back in the day, and I've been meaning to go back and finish 2 because, I forgot about that. The Final Fantasy movie. It wasn't bad.
I want to go back and rewatch it.
It wasn't bad on its own as a sci-fi film. But the graphics have aged badly because they always age badly because they chose realism, and of course it wasn't really tied into the games all that much either.
Yeah, it's kind of, someone mentioned Final Fantasy X. Someone's like, well, where do I start? That's all. They come out with 16 games. I'm like, you could play them all in any order. They're unrelated. So where do you start? And I was like, Final Fantasy X is a great first Final Fantasy game to play. But I'm thinking about it, and I think I don't love it. Like, I like some of the aesthetics of it, but I don't love it. But it's a really easy one to be able to jump in and play and get it and get through the story and explore, and it has voice acting and stuff. It's a really easy, good first Final Fantasy game to play. Versus Final Fantasy, I'm trying to think of like what might be the worst first one. It might be Final Fantasy Tactics, just because the difficulty curve is brutal at times, especially if you're playing the War of the Lions version, which is harder than the American version was in the 90s. And so
8 is also a little wonky, I think.
First time you get to that first Tonberry battle where all the Tonberries come in and one-shot your whole party, you're like, what do I do? No. It's like, you got to go back to the map and grind, my friend. Welcome.
I hear you. If I had to tell someone what would be the first game to start with when it comes to JRPGs, I'd probably point them to Blue Dragon on the Xbox 360 because it's such the last time you got the composer, the director, and the artist on the same project, you got Chrono Trigger. So I'm like, that's pretty good, but it's a really good, solid beginner JRPG, I think. And, it doesn't go too heavy on a lot of elements, and it doesn't get too confusing. And it's got a fun little story, fun little lighthearted tone. It's not as well loved by a lot of people, but I liked it. I had fun with it, and that's always what I look for when it comes to something. Did I have fun with it? Did I have fun with Final Fantasy 13? No, I did not.
I actually really like Final Fantasy 13. There's a lot of things that I really like about it. I don't know. I could do like a whole spiel on Final Fantasy 13. I understand why people don't like it. Same thing with 16. Yeah. There's lots of people like, I hate Final Fantasy 16. Like, Final Fantasy 16 is awesome, but the people who complain about it are correct in their own way, because first thing you do when you play it, you're like, is this a Final Fantasy game? You're like, no, but it's still good.
It's not quite like, it's not quite Final Fantasy, but
there's like departures, and then there's departures. And Final Fantasy 16 is like, its world is kind of a departure, but its gameplay they should have called it like Final Fantasy Tactics Action or something. Something else. It shouldn't be one of the numbered games, but
Kiko 2 says Nier Automata is pretty laid back. No, it is not.
I think it's pretty intense, but it has great laid back. I mean, between the intensity, it's like, this is nice. This music is so nice and relaxing. I really like Nier Automata as well. I don't think I'd call it a JRPG though. It's definitely an action game with RPG elements. I don't think I'd call it a JRPG at all, but it's good. I like it.
That was one thing that I was resistant on when it came to playing 12 was when because I love a turn-based battle system, right? Mm-hmm. That's because I have a terrible twitch reflex. It makes a lot of games, genres like fighting games and platformers, sometimes borderline impossible for me to play effectively. I'm just a button masher with a fighting game. But when it came to turn-based RPGs, I could take my time. I had time to think and react. That was very appealing for me. So I was resistant when it came to the MMO style live action kind of battle system they had, and the ones in the Tales games too. Although I can play the Tales of games.
So Final Fantasy 12 is more fun when you think of it as it is. it's the ATB system, but put on put on 3 dimensions, like put on a battlefield, and it kind of you can automate actions, so it kind of takes some of the intensity out of it. But you absolutely can play Final Fantasy 12 more like a turn-based game, just like Dragon Age Origins. Dragon Age Origins, it's not a JRPG, but it's one of my favorite RPGs. You can program all your characters to react to certain things with certain actions, and that basically stops you from going, oh, I didn't notice that was happening, and I didn't pause the game and react. But you can pause, take your time, menu if you want, wait for things to happen. So Final Fantasy 12 is really good once you kind of get around the fact that gambits are good when you're kind of rolling through the desert, auto killing wolves. But when you actually do a boss, you can't just rely on the gambits. The gambits are there so that if in the intensity of the moment you forget to heal someone, your character will heal them. Forgot to press the heal button, or no, I need to heal, be proactive healing. Pause, queue up the Curaga or whatever. So Final Fantasy 12, I love the battle system once I figured it out. It's by the battle system, even though he dropped out of the project pretty early, it was designed by the guy who did Final Fantasy Tactics. And it's pretty good in my opinion.
It's a lot more versatile and useful than the Kingdom Hearts battle system, which is, Donald, you did not heal me. Why did you not heal me, Donald? No, Donald, don't heal me now. Use Fireball now. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I have my problems with, I enjoyed that first Kingdom Hearts game, but that second one lost me when the plot became way too complicated to follow. It's like, you guys don't need to have this complicated of a plot when you have the elevator pitch of Disney meets Final Fantasy. Like,
yeah, I think at the complicated plot, I'm trying to figure out what the complicated plot came from. And my suspicion is that, like, you had a bunch of teams working on separate set pieces, and then you had a writer who's like, okay, now write a reason for them to go to the next set piece. And they're like, so let's see here. Donald and Mickey, they hear about something over there, and now we're going. It's like, when you look at it, like, all of the craziness of the plot of those games really comes down to just trying to get you to the next set piece, the next area of the game, which is the main point of a plot in a video game, is to move you between set pieces. But they just did it in the most obtuse and bizarre fashion.
Yeah,
I don't even remember the plot from Kingdom Hearts 2.
Oh, you started off with this is where they introduced the dichotomy between the heartless and the nobodies, which a heartless is somebody who's had their heart taken out, but a nobody is a body that's had their heart taken out, and it makes kind of a separate person. It lost me. It lost me right about there. And then they kept rolling with that, because then you had the main cast basically split into different people and an organization that you never found out what their true motives were. It was just, I just referred to it as incomprehensible bullshit and didn't bother with it. Even worse, if you're looking at the gap between 2 and 3, that's filled with different entries on different consoles, Game Boy Advance and 3DS and mobile releases, and some didn't even get to get an entry in a release in the US. It's like, it was impossible to follow. But the ones who are hyper fixated on that plot are obsessive about it. They claim it makes sense, but I'm like, they start trying to explain it to me, and my eyes roll so far into the back of my head, I can see my gray matter. It's not worth it to me. I was like, keep it simple, stupid. When it comes to storytelling, just keep it simple. You don't have to get too overcomplicated. And I say that for books as well. If you're unsure that you can pull off a complicated plot, or you can't split everyone off in 5 different directions and bring them back at the end, just do a simple one, or do a flat arc. There's nothing wrong with a flat arc character.
Yeah.
Conan's
no one really cared that Gandalf didn't grow by the end of The Hobbit, and they didn't really care that he left them and disappeared for a while to do something that wasn't even in the book. Like, no one thinks, like, was really the big problem. It's like, what was Gandalf off doing with the necromancer? They should have had like 5 chapters of that. It's like, no, that's big. I mean, he correctly identified that's like, that would be a distraction from the main story, which is about getting the dragon treasure and all the things that happen with that. So it's okay to not have those things in the story, or just kind of have them off to the side. I actually remember this. One of my favorite Brandon Sanderson books is Way of Kings. But I realized as I grew as a writer, about 30% of that book is completely superfluous. All of the entire section with Shani, doesn't matter to the main plot at all. It's only kind of side character stuff that might matter later. And then he has all these interludes that don't have anything to do with anything. So Way of Kings is a good book, and those interludes are interesting only because they hint at the greater world. By the time I got to the third book, all of those things were so distracting. It was just boring. It was a boring read by the time I got to the third Stormlight Archive book. And I realized that's what it was, is that you just have a lot of stuff that is unrelated to the main conflict and the character people care about. If you kind of cut it, if you cut it by 30% and cut those characters out or had them in a second book that was just those characters, it would have been better. And it's the same thing with Robert Jordan and like those middle Wheel of Time books, where it's like, this character's doing this character's, 5 characters doing 5 different things. All the plots kind of inch forward, and then the book ends. And you're like, that was boring and bad. If he had picked one plot and had the whole plot happen for that one book, all the middle Wheel of Time books would have been great. It's just you would have people go, well, why is this book all about Matt? I wanted Rand. It's like, well, this book's all about Matt. Sorry.
I kind of got to wonder if these are books that are made by folks with ADD for folks with ADD, like people who are so distracted that, they're so easily distracted. Their thoughts are always going in different directions. So they've got different plots going in different directions.
Here's different candy. Here's different candy, Cool,
yeah,
cool.
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I've stumbled across an interesting thing here. I haven't read Sanderson yet, not for anything malicious. I just haven't gotten around to it. And he kind of got big when I was in a bit of a lull in my reading, and I've only picked back up in the last year and a half or so.
Yeah, if anyone's interested in Sanderson, I'll give a couple recommendations of books of his that I think are legitimately good. And there's a caveat here, which is that if you don't like book 2 of the series, it's okay to put it down. And I feel like Sanderson is great at book 1. For whatever reason, he's able to do a book 1 of a series, and it's like the best book 1 you've ever read. Book 2, his book 2s are some of the worst book 2s, in my opinion, where it's kind of like it's hard to do a midpoint of a book. And so his tend to just be a bunch of things you don't care about. They kind of go nowhere. Like every book 2 by Brandon that I can think of just isn't good. I don't like it. It's not what I want as a reader, right? It's like kind of the opposite of Empire Strikes Back, where like there's a lot of chaos and people are assembling and something big happens. It's more like there's a lot of chaos. Book 3.
Right. It might be that he's thinking, like a lot of us do, several books down the line, and he's just using the book 2 to build towards book 3.
Yeah.
Forgetting that book 2 has to do that, but it also kind of has to have its own story as well.
Yeah, it has to have a beat. It has to have a big beat to it. And I did that with Needle Ash. When I did Needle Ash, which you could buy it as one complete like big book now. I split the story up into 3 books. I wrote them all at once. The second book ends with like a very strong story beat, like action, resolving of the conflict that takes place entirely within that book before you get onto book 3. And the overarching conflict isn't resolved, but there is a conflict that's resolved. And that's kind of the case with like Stormlight Archive book 2, which is called, Words of Radiance. But here's the trick to reading Words of Radiance. You can skip the first 600 pages and then just read the rest of it. And you won't miss anything. It's 600 pages of the characters flailing around, falling backwards on their faces, going backwards from all the stuff they learned in the previous book, figuring out their mistakes and then fixing them. Like nothing advances plot-wise until the very end of the book. Nothing. And that's a big problem. It's the same thing with Mistborn book 2. Like, nothing, the plot, like we want to get closer to resolving the conflict, and you just don't. Characters just have a bunch of introspection and little interior conflicts, and then you just set up book 3, and that's the kind of, and I don't like that personally. I find that a boring read. The characters, I think, need to be having those conflicts as you're moving the plot forward, and it just doesn't seem to work that way. Anyway, my recommendation for Brandon Sanderson, Way of Kings is great. If you start reading book 2 and you feel like putting it down, just skip to the end and then maybe stop after that. Don't read Oathbringer or whatever. Or do the same thing with that one. Just read the second half of that book. Read the first 100 pages, skip 500, and read the second 800 or whatever. I don't remember. It's such a long book. So, but Way of Kings is legitimately a great fantasy novel, and so is the first Mistborn book. Both of those are really good. And those are the ones that I trust.
I trust at least he'll finish his series, unlike Rothfuss or Martin. And
he's a pro. He's a pro. He knows, and
he's written a lot. Like his prolific writing is very inspiring to see, and it genuinely seems like a nice guy. So, I had a quick question in the chat. Andrew Kimmel wants to know, who is your favorite writer?
My favorite writer, myself. Obviously,
it's valid.
Here's that book.
If you're not your own biggest fan, who will be?
Myself. I'm the best. I'm my favorite writer. And that's true. I write books that I personally love to read. If we're looking backwards, I hate to pick one because there's so many great writers that I like, but I like Tolkien. That's an easy, like, oh, you're like, yeah, I really like Tolkien. He's amazing at what he does. I like Michael Moorcock. I like, who's the kind of the opposite of Tolkien, right? Who else? That I like Robert E. Howard is probably my favorite short story writer of all time. Right.
Yeah. So I grew up on the age of Dragonlance in the 80s and 90s mass trade paperbacks, right? That's when I started getting, Dragonlance and the Dritz novels and everything like that. So I did not start reading Robert E. Howard until very recently, when Razorfist started saying, hey guys, read pulps, because pulps are really good, and you go back and read and you start to see why these are considered classics, why these older books that were from before my time stand the test of time. Mm-hmm. And I've been listening to some Solomon Kane and some Walter B. Gibson writing, some shadow stories, and it's like, yeah, these are very well written, very tense and energetic, good books. So it's always, it's great to see a lot of indie authors trying to keep that old school mindset alive, and bring their own interpretations of it, because the pulp format's been kind of fell on the wayside once the mass paperbacks came into play, and people started to really go, hey, I like this story, I want to see it go on for 5, 6, 7 books, And some people don't care for that as much anymore. And Martin and Rothfuss I think are to blame for a little bit of that bad press in the fantasy genre.
Yeah, and I think tastes change. The part of the strategy, like the old strategy for selling books, was to make series. So if you've ever heard of this, like 20 books to 50K group, this was a big thing 5-6 years ago.
I had Craig was the guest before you on the Authors Outpost. I had him on last week.
So part of this strategy a lot of these guys worked out was basically doing the opposite of what I do. I write whatever I want to, and I see what people like. Kyle Potter, who's so lucky to have people who like my writing. Kyle Potter loved this book, Allshalfalda, which
is that how you say it? I'm not gonna lie, that word trips my tongue up a little.
Allshalfalda. Okay, it's All Shall Fall. It's an immortal song with the at the end. So that's where the name came from. As it was a placeholder name. Sorry, my autofocus is doing weird stuff again. It's a placeholder name, and I just kept it, kind of like Crab People, right? I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make it sound cool. All shall fall. All shall fall. If you guys don't listen to black metal, that's okay. Anyway, I held on to this book for over a year. I think I wrote it in 2020, and I released it last year. So I held on to it for 2 years, I guess. And I didn't release it in 2020 because it's a tragedy. It's very weird. And I was like, this is not a book people are going to like. It's too out there. It does things completely different from what every other book in the fantasy genre really does. As far as like the popular stuff, it's very different. And after like the election stuff of 2020, I just felt like people were and like the whole pandemic and everything, people were in too dark a state to just read a tragedy book. So I shelved it. Said, I'll edit it later. Maybe I can make it more palatable to people. I went back and looked at it. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to make it even less palatable. So when I edited it, I made it even weirder than it was and even more different from a regular fantasy novel than how it was. And I added more poetry and gruesomeness into it and strangeness. And like, then this book came out, right? People did not, I knew people were not really going to buy this book. And it was true, right? I'm like, most people are not going to like it, but I'll sell it. But some people love it because it's so different than what you usually do. That's just how sometimes books are. This is like really different from the trends that you see.
It's good to take chances though, especially with your own writing.
Yeah.
I've always advocated not just reading outside of your genre, because you never know what you can pick up from a different genre, but writing outside of your genre, because you never know what you can bring to another genre with a different set of eyes. I've always used the example of Sarah Douglas, who was a self-admittedly failed romance writer who came into the fantasy genre, and she took that romance mindset and made really epic heroes, really epic romance, and that ended up having that dark fantasy edge to it that you would catch with a lot of Terry Goodkind.
Yeah,
and I've loved her writing.
I forgot, I got off the rails. The strategy was, rather than writing weird stuff that's like one-off fantasy, it's to write a series that's in a niche. And so when someone reads it, they read through 20 books and buy 20 books from you. So you're selling 20 books to one person rather than 20 books to 20 people, if that makes sense. It's easier to sell that. So it's a volume thing. And if you could sell one book a day, before you know it, you're like making like 50 grand a year. The thing about that is that I'm not into writing 20 book long soap operas. I just wouldn't read that. And therefore I really wouldn't know how to write it, to be honest. Like, I just wouldn't know how to write that kind of series, because I can't stand reading them personally. And it's nothing against authors who do that. If that's your choice and that's what you like to do, is like the 20 book long series, that's fine. There's a market for that, obviously. But I wasn't going to do that. So if you're not going to do that, what's cool about the indie space is you can do whatever you want. You don't have to do that.
Yeah.
In fact, you can make decisions that are actively against financial interests, which would be to like release this book.
Perfect example.
Things that, you're like, I don't think I'll make any money on this, but
perfect example right there in the comment. R.H. Snow, she wrote Watcher of the Damned, which is essentially a Beauty and the Beast story set in Fallout with overtures of, a Western. And it was a fantastic book, and it stuck with me. And a traditional publisher would have looked at that and go, no, you need to change this and this and this. And it would have, in my opinion, taken away her unique voice as an author. And, I'm glad that I found her books as a, indie author and an indie reader. And I loved the, what she brought to her books. For Crusader Saracen, for 5 people not buying the Doorstopper fantasies anymore because they never finish, get angry and blame the consumer, the Easy Tread Pub author's solution. I do think, and I've held this for a while, that the people who are burned on Rothfuss and Martin not finishing their series for such a long time is putting a bit of a stink on the genre itself. And I think that's unfair to a lot of authors who are like, I've got a big epic that I want to read. I like reading big epics. I read all of Goodkind's books. I read all of the Sword of Truth. I didn't go too far to the books that came out after. So I don't actually know how the story ends, but I might keep it that way. I don't know. JD Cowens is correct. We need more weird stories. I agree.
Yeah.
People taking chances may end up creating a trend that you're didn't even know you wanted to read.
Yeah, that's what was I going to say? So people getting turned off from the genre. I think a lot of people who read, I don't know about Rothfuss, but certainly George R.R. Martin, were not your typical fantasy genre readers. They were normies, right? So normies kind of fall through these different genres and don't usually stick to them. And they're definitely not going to stick to them if, like, the author doesn't finish the series and like it falls apart or the show ends up being bad. They don't stick to the genre. So it's like Twilight was a big hit. I don't see too many like giant vampire romance stuff sticking around afterwards, even though tons of normies read Twilight.
Yeah, that was very much a
Thrones.
trend.
Yeah. And the Patrick Rothfuss thing, I only kind of realized it when Alexander Polacco, who goes by Conan Esquire on Twitter, pointed this out, that it's just a really bad ripoff of a Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. And it's like, I went back and I started listening to that again. I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is just Name of the Wind, but interesting, but good, with a good setting that you care about, right? And the series is finished, so you can get an end, right? It's set up in the exact same way, but it's just better in every possible way. So it's like Patrick read that and just thought, well, I'm going to do that, but D&D. And that's what it was. And I think for the moment it came out, it was like perfectly ascendant for millennials who had this idea of what Dungeons and Dragons was, like what we talked about, where it's like,
yeah,
we're collaborative storytelling. I'm like, I thought D&D was a game. Like, I don't think of Monopoly as collaborative storytelling, just because it's on a board. It's like, this is the story of how I became a real estate broker and crushed my friends. No, but it's like, I didn't think of it as like just storytelling. It's like, yeah, it's a fun setting. That's fun to think about, but you're not, I mean, the story is like, oh, you remember that alligator, you rolled a 1 and the alligator bit you in half. It's like, I remember that. Yeah. The alligator bit my wizard in half and that was the end of him. Right. We remember those little stories from when you did the campaign. The story was like what you did, not like, oh, well, now my campaign, you have to go fight a wizard. It's like, well, what if we want to kill the bartender? It's like, you need to go fight the wizard. That's, the campaign approach. Anyway, I think it was ascendant for like that mentality of what people wanted, which was more kind of escapist fantasy into Dungeons and Dragons. Escapism was really big 10 or 15 years ago. It still remains big, but it was huge in 2010.
Going to go to Crusader Saracen for another 5. It's not just Rothfuss Martin. It's also authors stringing along other writers for $20 without a promise of resolution in sight. And I think once you start to get a decade past the release of your last book, that tends to sour a lot of people, especially when you look at Martin, who is so old and he does not have, not only do I not think he can finish, he might finish Winds of Winter, but not only do I think he won't finish the series, I don't think he can finish it in 2 books, given the pace at which he writes and how far he has to go from where he left off to where the series has to end.
Yeah, and how many little threads have to be tied up.
A lot.
Like, and each character has their own little plot.
Yeah, we were left off way in like season 4 in the TV series, and like seeing everything that has to go on. It's like, oh my gosh. Yeah, I don't think he can do it. And I don't know if he's even going to bother. And I'm kind of checked out on Game of Thrones. I loved it at the time, loved reading it. I would reread them. But, and I don't doubt that he's a good writer in his own way, although he's kind of failed at his whole, how he was trying to inject his theme is to basically to prove Tolkien wrong, that people are crap and no one's good. And like, well, you can't prove your point if you don't finish making it.
Yeah.
So, Tolkien whooped your ass there, boy.
You prove it in a meta way, which is like, people are garbage. That includes me because I'm not going to finish what I started.
Yeah, right. And Rothfuss, I think he's come across as trying to use mental health issues as a reason for that. From what I've heard, it sounded more like he wrote himself into a corner and he doesn't quite know how to get his way out of it. But I would have thought his publisher would have been like, hey, it's been 12 years. At what point are you in breach of contract with your publisher?
Yeah, his agent or publisher came out and was like, yeah, he sent me like half a chapter. I haven't, what is he talking about? The first draft is done. I've seen nothing from this guy, which was interesting. I think, I don't know. There were people who said, I can't write because Donald Trump won an election. I don't know, man. There's people who wrote when they were like in concentration camps. So, I don't want to whatever your problems are, that's that. But at a certain point, the excuses run out. My dog ate my homework. My grandma died. My mom died. My dog.
Your grandma died again. I
got a new dog. He ate the homework and died.
Right.
My other grandma died. Right. Yeah. Like, okay, you're your
Your
20
grandma's
weeks
died
on
3
this
times
paper.
now. What's going on here? How many grandmothers
Yeah.
do you actually have? I've actually had that happen to me at my job. Some of the
So Nico says Game of Thrones is not real fantasy. It's a political thriller with giant fire spitting lizards. Belongs right beside Tom Clancy books.
Hey, that's fair and that works. And hey, it caught people's attention. You know,
I
like
actually think it's a soap opera with dragons.
And
that's not a bad
dragons.
thing.
That's a
Marvel books from the 80s are soap operas in comic book form. And
right.
Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter wanted it that way. He's like, we're going to write soap operas because that's what's going to sell. And he was damn right. They were selling 100,000 copies of every series every month. Holy crap. That guy was printing money for Marvel in the 80s.
Yeah. I wasn't reading the comics back then. I've always been a better comic reader than a comic collector, but I enjoy them. Ultimate Kahuna for $4.99. An orc with face paint talks to a wizard. No punchline. That's it. Woo. That's in joke with me. I branded myself the Orc Warlord of Epic Fantasy because my books are primarily about orcs. Like that's my favorite fantasy race. So when I decided to finally make a book, I was like, I'm going to center it.
I got orcs in mind, but there's kind of like a little bit deeper backlore to them once you get into it.
Yeah.
And they'll be the one that the next one that's coming out probably towards the end of the year. I've been putting it off for a while because it's just I've had a bunch of other things come up and stop me from editing the book. But anyway, when I finish up that one and get it out, that one has some orc lore in it as well. And I like it because, I think it's cool to just look at the other side rather than them just being twisted monsters. Maybe there's a little bit more to it. Mine are still kind of twisted monsters, but they're twisted by their own like dark gods, I guess.
That's essentially the elevator pitch for my book is what if orcs had their own chosen one, essentially. And that's a very, very oversimplification, but it's what an elevator pitch is. And I've gotten good feedback so far from my beta readers. And as soon as I get that damn cover in, I can go ahead and release For Too Long. But we're going to go ahead and wrap this up for too long for a second, guys, because I've got to get going and get some supper. And I know David's got to get going as well. I did want to answer one last question. Hardwood Bentho says, have I read any Lester Dent, the Doc Savage writer, H.P. Lovecraft, or Manly Wade Wellman? Well, that last one, I'm not sure who that is. I've wanted to go back and read some Doc Savage, but I have not, especially with a lot of the pulp writers. I'm also buried under a TBR that's got a lot of indie fantasy, and this is what's replaced my TV and movie watching, and it has very rarely let me down, and I really enjoy indie fantasy these days, and I'm hoping to get to your books as well at some point, David. I've got so many books I'm trying to read, and this is the unfortunate curse of the book readers and reviewers is there's always more coming out, and it never seems like there's enough time, and that's unfortunate. But I do want to thank you for being here.
Sometimes I appreciate it.
It is, but I'm going to do my damnedest. I want to thank everyone in the chat for dropping in and leaving your comments and your questions. You're all appreciated. I once again did not go over to Rumble all that much, but Bro Grimm dropped in, Maria Hargis dropped in as well, and somebody dropping a bunch of political nonsense in my chat also dropped in, but I'm not going to thank them. Everyone, thank you for dropping in. David, thank you for being here with me this evening, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Let me do some plugs for my stuff.
Go ahead, chill away.
So if you're not on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/at DVS Press, DVS PRESS, you can find my Patreon, patreon.com/David V. Stewart. I have a lot of stuff there, including I'm going to be doing monthly masterclasses. There's a lot of things. You get a free book every month for that. And then you can get a free book for being just on my mailing list, dvspress.com/free-book. This year's book is... I don't have it here. Demon Ex Machina.
Yeah. And all those links are in the description, everyone. So
check that stuff out. Someone did ask, how do we worry about going to different media? Let's cross that bridge when we get there. If my book is popular enough that someone wants to make a game out of it, I will figure that out when that time comes. Otherwise, I think it's going to cross the medium when I choose to make a game out of it. That's probably how it's going to be, right? Anyway,
it's got to be a turn-based, pixelated, a 16-bit RPG. That's all I look for. That's what I'd want if I was having a game based on my books. Kyle Potter, thank you for subscribing. I much appreciated, sir. Everyone, thank you for being here. David, again, thank you for being here as well for this episode of the Author's Outpost. I hope to have you back at some point again in the future.
All right.
In the meantime, everybody, hail the Iron Age. Thank you all for being here. Good night.
All right, I appreciate it.